So now that I've talked about them, I'll show you their pictures and I will turn it over to Larry at this time. Larry?
Thanks. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking an hour out of your day to spend time with Dolly and myself talking about our favorite topic, taxes. I've been with CBG a little over 10 years, and I consider myself to be a resource to you to help you understand how the pension plan works and how everything ties in together when you're starting to think about retirement. So thank you again for joining us, and I'd like to turn this over now to Dolly.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Dolly Rios, and as Larry just said, I am, not Larry, I'm sorry, Laurie said, I'm a CPA here in the state of New York, and I also consider myself a resource as I am, right now, I'm the only person answering the tax hotline, but if you do have questions regarding your taxes, you can call me at the toll-free number that we're going to be listing at the end. And also, I bilingual, so you can also call us in Spanish if you have questions, and that is your preferred language. Thank you so much for being here. Larry, to you.
So the biggest thing I'd like everyone to take away from this is the fact that ordained clergy have two tax statuses. Okay, we're one of the very few professions in the country that have two tax statuses. And what that really means is some of your income you are considered taxed as an employee, and some of the income you are considered taxed as self-employed. So this first column shows your dual tax status. Employees for federal income tax reporting purposes, you're considered self-employed for the taxes you pay towards Social Security and Medicare. In order to qualify and participate in the pension plan, you should receive a W-2, not a 1099. If you're working full-time and your employer is insisting on 1099ing you, you probably want to give me a call. You are exempt from withholding. So what that really means is you are responsible for paying the anticipated tax payments. You could do it on a quarterly basis, or if you could figure out what that tax will be, you could have your employer withhold more when they take out other taxes from your paycheck. So you have two tax statuses, and you're getting a W-2, and you have to pay taxes on the self-employed part. All right, let's go to the next slide. So on the left-hand side, the federal taxes that are withheld are based on income tax level brackets, and it pays for the general government services and all of the services they provide. The self-employment tax, SECA, is 15.3% of what you're making, and that's what goes towards your Social Security and Medicare benefits down the road when you retire. So this is important. Federal income tax and the self-employment tax. And the reporting of the self-employment tax is where people can make mistakes, and oftentimes the mistakes are correctable, but it's better to get it right the first time. So let's go to the next slide. Income while working. As an employee, you're taxed for the cash value you receive. Certain benefits we don't need to discuss right now, but if you want to go there, we can have a one-on-one conversation afterwards. And any other kind of self-employment work you might have, whether it's consulting or speaking engagements and that sort of stuff. But tax as a self-employed for SECA is the housing allowance number. That exclusion number is where you're paying self-employment tax, and you should have the federal taxable earned income involved with that. So really, we emphasize all the time that you should have a tax preparer do your taxes for you and have that tax preparer familiar with clergy taxes. Okay, it's very important because between the dual tax status and what's self-employed and what's employed and all that other stuff, mistakes can be made. Next slide, please. Let's talk about housing allowance. So you might be surprised to know that the IRS never printed or published a list of what is considered the numbers you use to calculate for housing allowance exclusion. There's a lot of generally accepted numbers that everybody agrees to, but the IRS has never given out a list. So when you declare or calculate your housing allowance, there are three ways to do it. The first one is the number you give your vestry resolution that they have to pass in their board minutes. The second number is your actual money you spend maintaining your primary dwelling, and you do that by collecting all your receipts and all your invoices and bills and keeping that in a folder and adding that up, or the fair market rental value of your place furnished plus utilities. And you can typically get that information from Zillow, newspapers if they're still out there. Certainly, if you have a congregant member who's a realtor, they can get you comps or comparison prices, but you need to calculate the actual cost or the fair market rental value furnished, and then provide one of those two numbers to the vestry. Now, if you live in church provided housing, it's the fair market rental value of the church provided housing as furnished with utilities if paid by the church. So I'm often had conversations with cleric who say, I live in a church-owned housing and I don't have a housing allowance. Well, that's wrong. So if you're convinced that because you live in a church-owned housing, you don't have housing allowance exclusions to work with, you need to have a conversation with either the tax hotline, Dolly, or myself. Okay. So there are three ways to calculate it: the number you give your vestry, actual cost, or fair rental value furnished with utilities. Next slide, please. Sometimes you might have an interim job. The IRS rules say indefinite period or lasts for more than 1 day is interim, even if it's 1 day and it results in relocation. So an interim residence, you consider your primary residence for tax purposes. So if you go to another job and lasts for 1 day, more than 1 year, then that becomes your primary residence typically when you move there. And that's the number and the house that you use for calculate your housing. If it's less than 1 year, you could use the numbers for your primary home where you are today. This is IRS kind of stuff. It's not pension rules. This is IRS rules. Very strict about that. Next slide, please. So for housing allowance for interim, it results in a relocation for 1 year or less. So your original home is your primary residence for housing allowance. And housing at interim locations can be treated as a reimbursable business expense. And we talk about business expenses later on. So it's important that you recognize that if it's less than 1 year, it's treated one way. If it's more than 1 year, it's treated a different way. And that's the IRS, okay?
Yes, so let's go through an example of a compensation package and how is that going to be treated for purposes of your taxation. So we have this Father Smith's compensation package includes an annual salary of $80,000 and designated housing allowance of $20,000 for the total package of $100,000. In this specific case, we're going to go over the numbers that Larry mentioned before. So his actual cost of maintaining a home, paying utilities, and his furnishings are actually $21,600. And the fair rental value of his home as furnished plus utilities is $21,000. Since the designated housing allowance was $20,000, and that is the lowest of the three numbers, that is the number that he'll use for purposes of the exclusion when he's preparing his taxes. So just keep that in mind that after calculating the three numbers, we're using the lowest of the three. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we go with what is taxable for federal income tax purposes and what is taxable for self-employment or SICA tax. So the Reverend John Smith may exclude the $20,000 as we just discussed in the previous slide from his gross income for federal income tax purposes. So that means that his taxable income is this $60,000. But his taxable income for self-employment will be his total compensation. He'll take his total annual salary plus the housing allowance, and he'll pay self-employment tax on the entire compensation. So please don't forget that piece, because a lot of some of the calls that I get are from related to not having include the housing allowance for the computation of your SICA tax, and that is wrong. And remember, you can go back 3 years to amend your tax returns. And if the mistake happens for a period that is beyond those 3 years, you'll have to do other things with the Social Security office, but that is beyond what will go in this webinar. Next slide, please. And we know here we are going to be talking about the home office deduction. As some of you know that that home office deduction is allowed for a self-employed individual. That's why we are keeping it here, because the home office deduction went away for W-2 employees. So you would say to yourself, well, I am an employee for federal income tax purposes, but I'm self-employed for for Social Security and Medicare. So if you have other work where you don't have an office, such as I would say supply work or that type of work, you might be able to use the home office deduction for those to apply against those type of earnings that you get, but not for your employment where you're getting a W-2. And remember that in order for you to take the home office deduction, the IRS has very strict rules as to what it is, how it is that the office deduction is defined. They say that you need to have some space in your home that is exclusively and regularly used for business, and that you don't have any other fixed location to go to conduct your business. That's why the W-2 work would not apply. The home office deduction would not apply to that type of work. It would only be applicable to your self-employment income. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you know, here at the Church Pension Group, there are a lot of tax resources that are made available to you. If you go to the CPG website, one of those resources is the 2024 Church and Clergy Tax Guide. And by the way, Larry, is that available, the 2024 Church and Clergy Tax Guide? Is that available on the website? I know that the Clergy Tax Return Preparation Guide is available, but I wasn't sure if the Church and Clergy Tax Guide is available on the website. But actually, there is a link in there that tells you that if you want to know more about ministers' taxes, you can actually go to that link, store.churchlawandtax.com. I actually find that that Church and Clergy Tax Guide is an excellent document, and I actually buy it every year to provide guidance to you, because I find that he goes through a lot of examples. Richard Hammer goes through a lot of examples that are, applicable to many other things that are unusual things, such as severance pay. What do I do with that? What do I do if I have two homes? So I really think it's a good resource if you want to know more about situations that are not very, everyday type of situations. And we at the CPG website, we have the 2024 Clergy Tax Return Preparation Guide for 2023. And I believe the one for 2024 taxes will be available sometime in January. Would that be January or February? Yes. And we also have the tax supplement on the CPG website and the federal reporting requirements for institutions. Sometimes I get phone calls from employers. So a good resource for you would be to refer to that 2024 federal reporting requirements, because it has a lot of good information about what the employer should be doing on how they should be doing certain things. And as always, we always recommend that you consult with a tax advisor or accountant who is familiar with clergy taxes. Some of you who have called me, who have made calls to the tax hotline, have asked me if I know of any specific CPAs or tax preparers who are familiar with ministers' taxations. I would always refer you to the State Society of CPAs in your state. That is usually a resource, or your own colleagues in your own, circles will probably know a good CPA, but it's important that they understand the intricacies of clergy taxation in order for you to have a good result.
So to summarize, the 2024 documents are on our website, where Dolly and I and some of our colleagues are in the process of updating it. So it'll be the 25 clergy guide for 24 taxes. So the federal reporting version of that will be out mid-January. And then the other tax-related documents should be out by the end of January. So Dali's phone number, it's toll-free. She speaks both Spanish and English. I'm still struggling with English. We have the client services, the phone number and their email. We had a QR code that you can use your phone. That'll take you to being able to schedule a one-on-one phone conversation with me. Yep. And you could take a picture of this if you need to. And then the next slide is, I think, is just our disclaimer.
Good.
Yep,
Yes.
that basically just says everything we've said is educational. It's not advice. And if we misquoted something, the rules in the pension plan oversee whatever we said.